Hello children, welcome to my class. Children, in my last two classes, I have started a first chapter from your book, Supplementary Reader in English for Class 10, Footprints Without Feet. The name of the chapter is A Tramp of Surgery by James Herriot. In my last two classes, I had already given you a message of the story, summary of the story, and also explained till paragraph number 6. Now, in this class, I will be starting from paragraph number 7. Let's begin paragraph number 7. When they had finished, Tricky took a walk round the shining bowls, licking casually inside one or two of them. Next day, an extra bowl was put out for him, and I was pleased to see him jostling his way towards it. Who are these they, children? They are the dogs in the surgery, and I is the narrator, Dr. James Herriot. From then on, his progress was rapid. He had no medicinal treatment of any kind, but all day he ran about with the dogs, joining in their friendly scrimmages. He discovered the joys of being bowled over, trampled on, and squashed every few minutes. He became an accepted member of the gang, an unlikely, silky little object among the shaggy crew, fighting like a tiger for his share at mealtimes and hunting rats in the old hen house at night. He had never had such a time in his life. Who is this he? He is none other than the pet dog of Mrs. Pumphrey, Tricky. Explanation. When all the dogs finished their food, Tricky went around looking at the shining bowls and also licked a few bowls. So from next day, Dr. Herriot started keeping an extra bowl for him, and he was happy to see Tricky running towards his bowl. Tricky started recovering at a very high speed. He did not require any medicines. He started playing with the other dogs the whole day. They played with each other, bumped into each other, and squashed each other. All the other dogs accepted him as a family member, although he was very different from others, as he was very well taken care of by his owner, Mrs. Pumphrey, whereas the others weren't. Tricky started to fight for his meals like a tiger with his fellow dogs that were much larger in size than him. And at night, he would also hunt rats in the hen house. He was enjoying his days in the surgery as he had never had such time before. Next paragraph. All the while, Mrs. Pumphrey hovered anxiously in the background, ringing a dozen times a day for the latest bulletins. I dodged the questions about whether his cushions were being turned regularly or his correct coat worn according to the weather. But I was able to tell her that the little fellow was out of danger and convalescing rapidly. The word convalescing seemed to do something to Mrs. Pumphrey. She started to bring round fresh eggs, 2 dozens at a time, to build up Tricky's health and strength. For a happy period, my partners and I had 2 eggs each for breakfast. But when the bottles of wine began to arrive, the real possibilities of the situation began to dawn on the household. It was to enrich Tricky's blood. Lunch became a ceremonial occasion with 2 glasses of wine before and several during the meals. Explanation. All this while, Mrs. Pumphrey used to call several times a day to inquire about Tricky. Mr. Herriot used to avoid questions about the coats, beds, etc. But he told her that Tricky was doing very good and was recovering very fast. Mrs. Pumphrey wanted Tricky to recover fast, so she started sending 2 dozen eggs every day for him, which were used by Mr. Herriot and his partner for breakfast. To improve Tricky's blood, Mrs. Pumphrey started sending in bottles of wine, which again were relished by Mr. Herriot and his partner. He started enjoying 2 glasses of wine before lunch and a few with the meal. So you can see, children, they were actually having gala time. Next, we could hardly believe it when the brandy came to put a final edge on Tricky's constitution. We are Mr. Herriot and his partner Tristan. For a few nights, the fine spirit was rolled around, inhaled, and reverently drunk. They were days to deep content, starting well with the extra egg in the morning, improved and sustained by the midday wine, and finishing luxuriously round the fire with the brandy. It was a temptation to keep Tricky on as a permanent guest, but I knew Mrs. Pumphrey was suffering, and after a fortnight I felt compelled to phone and tell her that the dog is recovered and was awaiting collection. Within minutes, about 30 feet of gleaming black metal drew up outside the surgery. The chauffeur opened the door, and I could just make out the figure of Mrs. Pumphrey almost lost in the interior. Her hands were tightly clasped in front of her. Her lips trembled. "Oh, Mr. Herriot, do tell me the truth. Is he really better?" "Yes, he's fine. There's no need for you to get out of the car. I'll go and fetch him," said Mr. Herriot. Explanation. Brandy was sent for Tricky. Mr. Herriot couldn't believe that Mrs. Pumphrey actually wanted them to give brandy to Tricky. However, they shared it amongst themselves. Some days Mr. Herriot was very pleased, as he would start his day with extra eggs. Then he would have a few glasses of wine in the afternoon and would end the day happily with brandy in the evening. Mr. Herriot humorously said that he was really tempted to keep Tricky as a permanent guest at the surgery, all because of all the good things sent for the dog by Mrs. Pumphrey. But he also knew that Mrs. Pumphrey, who was like a mother to Tricky, was really suffering and really wanted Tricky to be with her soon. So Mr. Herriot called up Mrs. Pumphrey to come and pick him up. Within a few minutes, a long black car came outside of the surgery. When the chauffeur opened the door, Mr. Herriot saw an excited and nervous Mrs. Pumphrey sitting inside. She asked nervously if Tricky was really better. The doctor replied positively. Next. "Yes, he's fine. There's no need for you to get out of the car. I'll go and fetch him." I walked through the house into the garden. A mass of dogs was hurtling round and round the lawn, and in their midst, ears flapping, tail waving, was a little golden figure of Tricky. In 2 weeks, he had been transformed into a lithe, hard-muscled animal. He was keeping up well, with the pack stretching out in great bounds, his chest almost brushing the ground. I carried him back along the passage to the front of the house. The chauffeur was still holding the car door open, and when Tricky saw his mistress, he took off from my arms in a tremendous leap and sailed into Mrs. Pumphrey's lap. She gave a startled "Oh!" and then hurried to defend herself as he swarmed over him, licking her face and barking. Tricky was very happy to meet his mistress after so long. During the excitement, I helped the chauffeur to bring out the beds, toys, cushions, coats, and bowls, none of which had been used. As the car moved away, Mrs. Pumphrey leaned out of the window. Tears shone in her eyes. Her lips trembled. "Oh, Mr. Herriot," she cried, "how can I ever thank you? This is a triumph of surgery." Explanation. Mr. Herriot went inside to get Tricky. He went to the garden behind the house and saw all the dogs were moving around in the garden and Tricky was sitting between them. He was looking much healthier, playing with the other dogs, and his chest was touching the ground. He had become a good, muscular dog within 2 weeks. Mr. Herriot took Tricky to the front of the house and found that the chauffeur was still holding the door of the car. The moment Tricky saw Mrs. Pumphrey, he was overjoyed as Mrs. Pumphrey was. He jumped into the lap of Mrs. Pumphrey and started licking her face, barking in excitement. While this sweet reunion was happening, the chauffeur and Mr. Herriot got all his stuffs out to the car, which had not been used during the treatment in the last 14 days. As the car was moving, Mrs. Pumphrey leaned out of the window, expressed her heartfelt gratitude to Mr. Herriot with tears of joy in her eyes. She said that she could never thank him enough for what he had done. She said, "This is a triumph of surgery." So children, that was the explanation of the chapter. Now let me give you main points to remember. Dr. James Herriot stops his car and sees the deteriorated health of Tricky, the pet dog of Mrs. Pumphrey. He advises Mrs. Pumphrey to cut down his food immediately and give him exercises daily. Mrs. Pumphrey continues to overfeed Tricky, which worsens his health. She calls Dr. Herriot for help as Tricky wasn't eating anything and vomiting frequently and wasn't even playing or going for a walk. Dr. Herriot suggested Mrs. Pumphrey that Tricky should be hospitalized for about a fortnight for his treatment. Tricky's hospitalization left Mrs. Pumphrey and almost all helpers at home in tears. At the surgery, Tricky was kept on only water for first 2 days. His diet was increased according to the improvements he showed. No medical treatment was given to him. Tricky's progress was rapid and he started running, playing and barking with the other dogs in the surgery. Mrs. Pumphrey's anxiousness about Tricky's health went away on learning that he was convalescing or recovering satisfactorily. She started sending eggs, wine and brandy for him to enrich his blood. Within 2 weeks, Tricky was transformed into a flexible and hard-muscled dog. Dr. James Herriot calls Mrs. Pumphrey to come and take Tricky home. Mrs. Pumphrey thanked Dr. Herriot heartily and called Tricky's recovery a triumph of surgery. Let me give you few word meanings of the chapter. Bloated, excessive in size or amount. Rheumy, watery. Hastened, be quick to do something. Listless, lacking energy or enthusiasm. Malnutrition, lack of proper nutrition. Lumbago, pain in the muscles and joints of the lower back. Harness, a set of straps and fittings. Distraught, distressed, about a short period, soon fainted, wailings, crying with pain, grief, or anger, despairing, showing loss of all hope, glanced, take a brief or hurried look, surged, rushed, overflowed, sniff, the action of drawing in air audibly through the nose, whimper, moan, engulfed, sweep over. Throttle meaning ran or jogged, slopped meaning spill or overflow, jostling, pushing, elbowing, scrimmage meaning a confused struggle or fight, trampled, tread on and crush, shaggy meaning long, thick and unkempt, hovered, hanged or floated, reverently with deep and solemn respect, temptation, desire, arch, lithe, thin, supple and graceful, swarmed, move somewhere in large number, chauffeur, driver of a car, clasped, grasps something tightly with one's hand, tremble, shake or quiver. At last, hurtling, move or cause to move at a speed. So children, that was all for the chapter A Tramp of Surgery. I hope all of you have understood. Till my next class, stay good.